This presentation is available for MCLE self-study credit. If you would like to receive credit, you must take 3 actions. First, click the Show More text below on our YouTube page. The text will expand and show a link to download the handout materials. Once you finish watching this presentation, please click the quiz link to receive self-study credit. Once the quiz is successfully completed, you will receive a certificate via email within 72 hours. We hope you enjoy the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's program on artificial intelligence and privacy in the workplace. My name is Hayward Cho, and I'm the General Manager of ADR Services in Southern California. Before we dive into our program today, I would like to briefly address 2 housekeeping items. First, please note that the MCLE certificates will be emailed to you after the program. Second, please submit your questions via the Q&A function below. We will try to get to your questions at the end of the presentation, and if by chance, if we can't, the speakers will address your questions via email. Now I have the pleasure of introducing to you our speakers. Natalie Pierce, Vinhcent Lee, and Phyllis Cheng. First, Natalie is a partner and practice group chair at Gunderson Dettmer, the #1 law firm in the world representing venture capital firms and technology companies at all stages of growth, from the earliest stages of financing, to public companies. Her practice focuses on the needs of startup and emerging growth companies. Natalie is focused on counseling companies on incorporating robotics, biometrics, telepresence, artificial intelligence, and other enhancement technologies into the workplace. She hosts the Future Work Playbook podcast series that is in its 2nd season and is fluent in Spanish. Natalie has a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Columbia University School of Law. She was named Chambers Minority Lawyer of the Year and as one of Daily Journal's top artificial intelligence lawyers in 2019. She is also on the governing board of the American Bar Association's Center for Innovation. Second, Vinhcent Lee. As legal counsel with the Greenlining Institute's Economic Equity team, Vinhcent leads Greenlining's work to close the digital divide, protect consumer privacy, ensure algorithms are fair, and that technology builds economic opportunity for communities of color. In this role, Vinhcent helps develop and implement policies to increase broadband affordability and digital inclusion, as well as bring transparency and accountability to automated decision systems. Vinhcent also serves on several regulatory boards, including the California Privacy Protection Agency. Vinhcent received his JD from the University of California Irvine School of Law and a BA in Political Science from the University of California, San Diego. Prior to Greenlining, Vinhcent advocated for clients as a law clerk at the Public Defender's Office, the Office of Medicaid Hearing and Appeals, and the Small Business Administration. Last and certainly not least, Phyllis Cheng. Phyllis Cheng is a neutral at ADR Services, Inc., where she mediates employment, wage and hour, civil rights, and other cases. She also serves on the mediation panels of the California Court of Appeal, 2nd Appellate District, and the U.S. District Court, Central District, California, where she runs its mediation practice group. Ms. Cheng was director of the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing under Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown, as well as a member of the Fair Employment and Housing Commission, Comparable Worth Task Force, and Commission on the Status of Women. Ms. Cheng was a partner at global firm DLA Piper's Employment Group, of counsel at employment firm Littler Mendelsohn, and associate at civil rights firm Hadsel and Stormer. She also served as senior appellate court attorney at the 2nd District Court of Appeal and deputy attorney general at the California Department of Justice. She is co-editor of California Fair Housing and Public Accommodations, managing editor of the California Labor and Employment Law Review, writer of the California Labor and Employment Case Law Alert, and contributor to California Employment Litigation and other publications. The State Bar named her the 2014 Ronald M. George Public Lawyer of the Year. Ms. Cheng received her BA and MED from UCLA, JD from Southwestern School of Law, and PhD from USC, where she was a James Irvine Fellow. So without further ado, I pass it to you, presenters.
Well, welcome. Before we get started, for anyone with a visual disability, please know that all of our slides have an abstract design and the ADR Services logo. Other than the 3 speakers' photographs, there are no additional images. We're going to be talking to you about artificial intelligence and privacy today. Now, artificial intelligence uses algorithms. Algorithms are a process or a set of rules to be followed in calculations or in solving a problem, particularly through computers. So for example, a recipe is an algorithm in that it says what must be done step by step. It takes inputs, which are ingredients of the recipe, and creates an output, which is the completed dish that you can enjoy. So you don't use a computer for those things, but that's a basic principle. So today, we're going to be talking about the issues listed here, AI uses for employers, legal and ethical issues associated with AI, the EEOC's increased focus on AI and algorithmic fairness, a regulatory outlook of what's ahead, as well as our recommendations on leveraging AI. So let's take a look at uses for employers. Now, in these and many other examples which we're going to give, business operations and decisions are informed by near constant collection and analysis of worker data. This trend towards a data-driven workforce has been exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, with workers experiencing more invasive forms of monitoring, both inside the workplace, such as tracking or social distancing behaviors, and in remote workers working from home, such as keystroke tracking. Warehouses and delivery workers have taken a lot of responsibility in the skyrocketing demands for delivered goods with constant surveillance and productivity tracking. Across the country, employers are increasingly using this kind of data and algorithms in ways that stand to have profound consequences for all kinds of employment issues, including wages, working conditions, race and gender equity, privacy, and workers' rights. So, for example, hiring software will score applicants based on their tone of voice and word choices. Algorithms are being used to predict whether workers will quit or become pregnant. Call center technologies are analyzing consumer calls and trying to figure out if workers how they're doing in real time to adjust their behaviors. And grocery platforms are monitoring workers and calculating metrics on their speed and their filling shopping lists. So in the next few slides, we're going to be showing you specific examples of how employers are using AI-powered tools to improve efficiency and reduce costs. Now, even if some of these examples have algorithms that primarily serve as customers, we as many employment lawyers will know that these metrics can also lead to possible whistleblower actions by employees. So all of these algorithms are very important to the employment arena. So I'm going to hand it over to Natalie.
All right. Well, first off, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be with you all, and that I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I guess I will say that so many of these trends that we've seen accelerated by the pandemic, we knew already that there were advantages and there were disadvantages. And, you know, on the one side, by being able to be remote and distributed, it allows workers who might not otherwise have the opportunity to apply for certain jobs because of where they work, because it's, you know, too expensive to be in the big cities, et cetera. They're seeing some advantages. And we have seen from, especially from the millennial generation, which is, now the largest population in the workforce, this real desire for that greater flexibility and wanting for greater trust. So now everybody's been forced into, or most people, obviously there's certain sectors that simply can't go remote, but so many companies now, most of them have some form of a remote and nomadic workforce, which presents other challenges of even just keeping track of where employees are. Now, what we've seen happen is exactly what you said, Phyllis, is that now the companies have, in many instances, been forced to have their workforces work from home. There is this concern that the productivity might not be there, and what are employees doing? And so you've seen this trend on the employer side of surveillance tools to really measure, as you said, that productivity, the keystrokes, what tools are employees using on the computer systems, what websites are they visiting? And you can, all these questions that you couldn't normally ask an employee in, say, an interview process, or even as part of managing performance, you can now, as an employer, get all these insights that may very well divulge that same kind of information. And so it's become this real balancing act. Now we recently did a survey of clients to see, well, what's going to happen is there going to be a return to normal? And it really looks like these trends are here to stay. And so I think for us lawyers, understanding the legal ramifications and being able to educate our clients and work, as a whole to kind of figure out what do we do in terms of the transparency, in terms of accountability, how do we measure the balance of wanting to trust and improve the productivity, but not being so invasive with the forms of surveillance that we are, it does become a step too far. And so I think these are the kinds of conversations that we're going to keep seeing. But when we surveyed our clients, half say that they will remain permanent remote workforces. So this trend, again, of the remote nomadic workforce is one that we don't see going away. And another third said that the plan was to always maintain some sort of a hybrid model. So I do think these are continuing questions that we'll be addressing. And when it comes to human resources, again, we'd already seen this trend of surveillance tools, but also this trend that we've really seen accelerated of what do you do if you need to hire talent, but you can't get close to them, or you can't and be inside. And so it's been evolving, well, let's say ping-ponging, right? We're still in the midst of this. However, the tools such as the high-tech and the remote hiring tools, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but what do you do when you have all these applicants? You'll never be able to meet them in person, and now you want to be able to sort through all these online applications and not have to go through them. So there's so many sorting tools. There's also a lot of programs now that will interview the candidate, record the interview, and also put candidates through game-based tests to really measure the aptitude. Now, in many ways, these tools are designed to level a playing field, increase fairness and access to jobs, measure what should be measured and is job related, but to take away some of these proxies, let's say, that have been used in the past, these false proxies of using referrals, looking at the schools that someone went to, names. We know from experience that even someone's name can have a negative impact on that individual's possibility of being selected. And so many of these tools just strip that out and say, okay, we are measuring what are the job duties and we're increasing opportunities. However, what we also know that even the best intentions sometimes lead to adverse consequences. And so, a good example is there was an e-commerce company that really wanted to focus on improving its hiring. So the hiring was fair and more diverse and more inclusive. The problem, however, was that when you're feeding the algorithm, the data that you're taking, the historical data may already be contaminated. And Vinhcent's going to talk much more about this, but this consequence of algorithmic bias that sometimes all it does is just exacerbate a trend. And so in the e-commerce example, what they found after testing this tool is that it was actually filtering out women in a way that didn't relate to the job. And it was little things like using the word execute and capture as a verb, which women don't use as often. And because of some of those correlations, then resumes that included associations to women's groups were similarly docking points for the candidates. And that tool, they stopped using that tool, but that's sort of one example of why we do need to keep eyes on these tools.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly add, in addition to that e-commerce example, there was a company using facial recognition for hiring, right? They would examine people's facial expressions. And turns out, that's not a very scientific way of evaluating candidates for their job competency. So actually, after a lot of media interviews and attention, they've discontinued that because there wasn't a strong showing of the science showing that certain facial characteristics correlate to job performance. So,
Yeah.
It's going beyond, right?
No, absolutely. And the impact was shown to be on women and on applicants, people of color. And so, yeah, it was just in this year that that the announcement was made. And so they're not using their visual analysis tool going forward. Oh, this is great. Okay. So I've been a fan of augmented reality for training purposes for a very long time because the studies have shown that showing somebody a PowerPoint, like for succession planning purposes, for training purposes, if you have an instructor sit down a group of people and sort of take them through, here's how you do it, here's how you do it, the retention rate's about 30%. However, if you are able to provide someone with a visor so that they real time and listening to an instructor in their ear can be seen, let's say it's an engine, and being instructed how it is that you do the repairs, how this works, etc. Your retention of that training increases to closer to 80%. And so this is taking it to a new level, because the question was, can augmented reality training take place in a dynamic environment? And so in this case, there's this company called Red 6, and just, I think it was just this week that Popular Science named them one of the new best companies in aerospace. And so, and they also just this summer got a $70 million award from the US Air Force. Now, what this does, which is why it's so fascinating, is that by providing our US Air Force fighter pilots with visors that have the augmented reality, rather than sending to, let's say, fighter planes up into the air for these simulated fights, the pilot can be up in the air training real time, not virtual reality in a false cockpit, but actually feeling the G forces, the maneuvers, etc. And what they see is an actual Chinese warplane or Russian warplane, and they can do that training. So it's has the ability to save millions of dollars, obviously much safer than having two warplanes doing maneuvers, and a very, very effective way to train. And I think we're going to see more and more uses of this type of training, which is different than virtual reality, where you're completely submersed, but really allows you to be in the environment and train and learn. So, and the nice thing about that is that it also applies the machine learning, so that as it's training pilots, it's also using what's working, what is not. And that's true in terms of maneuvering as well. Okay, Vinhcent.
And I'll just quickly clarify for folks who don't know, algorithms, before they were written, you had rules. People would write certain rules, like if this happens, then this happens, if that happens, then this happens. With machine learning, the computers are writing the rules. They're learning from each other. They're learning from the data, certain patterns. And they're like, well, this is the rule based off what we think it is. And it's a very powerful AI technique, but it has, as I'll mention, lots of drawbacks. So in the financial industry, you see a lot of AI use, right? They do a lot of different things, algorithmic lending, the modeling parts. And then there's a lot of fraud prevention, right? And those fraud prevention is, I think, the big use that's like everywhere now, in traditional banks and in fintech, because of AI, right? You can get lots of financial data. You can understand certain patterns are suspicious, and then you can confirm that with your investigators. So we're seeing a lot of fraud detection departments being supplemented by AI in financial sectors. What isn't as prevalent, right, is the use of algorithmic lending on traditional bankers, right? Traditional banks are pretty well regulated, and they're a little bit hesitant to switch to consumer lending decisions based on alternative data, all that data that is being collected about you. But fintech companies are. And that's leading to a lot of interesting things in the sector. You're seeing traditional banks get some of their market share eaten by these more nimble AI-focused fintech companies. But you're also seeing more access to financial inclusion for people who are underbanked or unbanked, right? So there's about 60 million people in California, or in the United States, that don't have sufficient access to credit. But when you use algorithmic lending and predictive modeling, you can look at a lot more data points than a human could, right? And you can determine creditworthiness, credit risk on way more factors, right? So in jurisdictions outside the United States where things aren't quite as regulated, you're seeing some lending models use what your phone battery is or who your friends on LinkedIn are. Things that may not be correlated to credit risk, but they are correlated, with higher profit margins or things like that. So I think the financial industry is very much embracing AI, traditional banks a little bit slower. But the risk of all of that, is that there is algorithmic bias. We've had recent data come out where in mortgage lending, where there is data on lending rates and race, that these algorithmic lenders are denying applicants of color loans at 40 to 80% more than they are denying white counterparts. UC Berkeley did a research study, and they found that algorithmic lenders as well as traditional lenders together overcharge similarly qualified Black and brown borrowers by $765 million a year in extra interest, right? So lots of potential for these tools, but a lot of potential for bias. And the research is still to be out there on what are the causes of that bias. But I'll just quickly note that there's the human intervention. We can have bad rules, but the big thing that we're noticing is that banks and financial industries are changing the price you pay based on what AI tells them about your shopping preferences. If you shop around a lot, you're more likely to get a better rate. If you live in an area that happens to have a lot of options, you're more likely to get a better rate. And that just so happens that disadvantages people of color who have fewer options. They've been redlined, they don't have access to banking. And in the insurance, this personalized pricing is pretty prevalent in the financial industry, the insurance industry, and more. And I just want to note that because we're going to revisit algorithmic bias a little bit later. So in education, academia, there's been the same embrace of AI. You've probably seen Turnitin.com. This plagiarism detection software, they have a corpus of other essays. The AI can quickly identify which parts have been copied, which haven't been. But what I think is pretty interesting and new is AI in admissions, right? You get the top colleges get, thousands and thousands of applications, right? And they're beginning to use admission algorithms to determine who should get in. And that saves a lot of time. That saves a lot of money as well. But the downside of that, and I'm going to keep saying the downside of things because that's kind of my job, and is that these AI systems are optimizing for the best profit for these schools, right? Not for educational outcomes. So we're seeing lower financial aid packages, lower scholarships. So it's good for the school, but maybe not so good for the student. And not on here, but there's also grading AI. So in the UK this year, because of COVID, they weren't allowed, they couldn't have their tests. So the UK created an AI system to do grading for everyone. And instead of grading students based on their performance that year, students were graded based on how well their school did historically. As you can imagine, students who did great at a bad school were disadvantaged, parents were outraged, and the UK actually had to roll back the entire thing and let teachers give grades. So, when embracing AI systems, there's also these downsides that these expensive systems can have a lot of resistance and some problems. Right. And then healthcare, we have a lot of more tracking and of employee health status basically on our phones now. There's contact tracing apps, and based on the internet, that all of the data brokers and the internet collections, they know where we travel and location wise. But employers are getting into that game as well, right? We're seeing a lot more employers having employees wear Fitbits. A lot of health insurers are working with employers to encourage this. This helps employees be healthier, but it also helps employers track, the health of their employees, and that can change significantly what you pay as a employer in health insurance, right? So there's a lot of potential there, but again, downside is more and more stratified risk pools. If we get better and better data on how sick everyone is, then what happens to the people who have, pre-existing conditions based on their data? Is it going to be really, really expensive? So those are things to think about. But one really interesting thing that's happening now is automated patient care. So we're having AI systems take over for doctors in a lot of instances in determining what kind of treatment you get. One example of this is they had an AI learn from thousands of CT scans from patients that had lung cancer. And the AI system quickly beat all of the oncologists at detecting lung cancer. Those are things that AI is good at. They can see these patterns. Where things get a little dicey is there was a hospital that used a patient care algorithm to determine who gets better care. One of the data points they used was how much people spend in healthcare is a proxy for how sick they were. And what ended up happening was, it turns out white people spend more for healthcare than Black people because of lots of different factors. But in this hospital algorithm, it just turned out because of that, white people got better care, even though they were equally sick than Black people, because they, as a demographic, spend more despite being equally sick. So there are downsides, there are risks. So be sure to consider all of those risks. In this case, that hospital algorithm never went live. It was caught by some researchers before. And there has been significant trainings by the vendor since then to ensure that hospitals don't misuse that algorithm. And then finally, drug discovery. Google, DeepMind, they have this great AI tool. They're beginning to use it to identify new drug combinations. So this has the potential to really drive down the cost of research and development of new pharmaceuticals. So, I like everything. AI can be a tool for good and bad. It's just how do you manage risk?
Well, looking at the legal field, I'm sure most of us will recall, or maybe we're still there when we were new associates, that the dreaded discovery of having to go through thousands and thousands of pages of documents, searching for evidence, trying to find emails, hidden letters, trying to find documents that might be privileged and responsive, and so on and so forth. So that is a big part of the legal community's job. But e-discovery has really changed the whole ballgame in that today, e-discovery can use algorithms to sift through thousands of the documents, emails, much faster, more efficiency, more effectively, identify responsive documents, flag privileged communications, and so forth. And I know that Natalie had actually interviewed one of these companies called Law Geeks, and maybe after I briefly cover it, Natalie, you can talk more about it. But apparently it's the only company, AI company in America to obtain a license to practice law. And apparently in a study by Stanford Law School, they found that 85%, there was only 85% accuracy for lawyers, but 95% accuracy for AI in this kind of e-discovery. It took the average attorney 92 minutes to review the contract. It took the AI system just 26 seconds. So this has a huge impact on billables, maybe switching from traditional hourly billable rates to flat rates for legal tasks. Still, I don't think machines can ever really replace the judgment of lawyers in working on briefs, writing legal argument, arguing in court, or participating in mediation, etc. But still, having the ability to do e-discovery much cheaper and faster is a game changer in the legal field. Natalie, do you want to comment about your interview with the Law Geeks leader?
Yeah, well, we are seeing the legal industry was bound to be disrupted as any other industry. And I think with good reason. You, Phyllis, gave the discovery example. Yes, I remember how brutal it was to just spend so much time looking for these keywords and through these e-discovery tools to be able to do it. And then the contract review, think of how many companies, how many in-house counsel that had to go through redlining contracts and saying, no, this doesn't really fit what we're comfortable with, and the time spent negotiating, it can be very dull work. And so what these tools do is they take some of the dull out and they increase the precision, and it allows attorneys to spend more time reviewing things and using their skills for the things that make us uniquely human, right? Like exercising our good judgment, making persuasive arguments, actually engaging in the negotiation. So there's so many things that law schools train us to do, and a lot of repetitive types of work that can be done. And the main thing for me is the access to justice. think about what these tools can do, the money that can be saved by municipalities, by schools, by healthcare system, by not having to pay for the time that it may take to outsource that kind of work. And we're also, and LawGeeks, the reason that they got their, their license to practice law was because of the Utah Sandboxes initiative. And I would recommend that everyone who's listening take an opportunity to check out the types of companies who've received that approval, and the kudos to the Utah Supreme Court for really pushing through this initiative. And it's just in 2 years since launch, really. And we're seeing such great outcomes in terms of giving that access to justice and access to tools. 87%, I think it is, of US citizens still can't afford a lawyer. So think about what some of these tools can do for somebody who needs to get a divorce, somebody who needs to write a will, and they feel like they can't do that because they can't afford to do that. So I'm thrilled to see many of these initiatives that are coming about.
So AI has also impacted the transportation industry. We all know about self-driving cars, which is just on the horizon, I guess, being used in many cities. Companies may start actually using self-driving cars for deliveries and other kind of businesses. The downside about that is that there's a lot of monitoring. Autopilot, when it's on autopilot, it may have sensors, cameras, radar, AI to travel between destinations. How long is somebody taking to go from one place to the other without a human operator? So, self-driving cars sound like a panacea, sounds like the Flintstones are going in or not the Flintstones, the other one, about the future, but the other cartoon.
The Jetsons.
That's
the Jetsons, yeah.
But self-driving cars have also had coming up against problems in that in March of 2018, Tesla's Model X sports utility vehicle was on autopilot when it had an auto accident and running into a lane divider. The driver was too reliant on the autopilot, and actually there was an accident. So no matter how good the technology becomes on self-driving cars, really ultimately drivers must be in control and be aware of what's going on. Also driver monitoring. Now, today with the whole issue of the supply chain being backed up, truck drivers are very, very much in demand and really need them to move merchandise around. A lot of the truck and delivery fleet drivers are subject to a lot of extensive electronic monitoring with sensors and trucks tracking everything from their locations, their braking, their acceleration patterns, speed, seatbelt use, when they take breaks and so forth. So a lot of this data probably would be collected had we not used AI. So this is a kind of situation where we kind of cross over into wage and hour concerns, into a little bit maybe too intrusive in what the employee might be doing in trucking. Also, transportation platforms. Now, you probably recall a lot of legislation in California, AB 5, that initially made all transportation platform companies like Uber and Lyft offer jobs, actually use their drivers as employees. And then there was an initiative that voters voted on that exempted some of these platforms. But nonetheless, whether or not these drivers are employees, whether they're independent contractors, there's still a lot of monitoring on who they pick up, where, They pick them up, where they drop them off, locations, communications through apps, customers' evaluations, and so forth. So there is a great deal of utility in having the transportation platforms. Many of us use these platforms in getting rides or delivering food or whatever. However, there is also the flip side to it, as we have pointed out along, of intrusion into worker rights, as well as getting more information than perhaps the employer needs to know.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on a couple things. Is that it is true that there can be over surveillance, and GPSs should not be on while employees are on break, as a easy for example. But many of these tools are being used for good, in that it's reducing incident of accidents, for example, seeing patterns of too fast of acceleration, or in certain parts of the cities more prone to potential accidents. And then I will also say that I know that there have been some challenges, but I need a fully autonomous vehicle. I have not driven now in 6 years because I just never have been a good driver. And so I've become very reliant on all these apps, individuals who can take me around, but I can't wait until I have my own fully autonomous vehicle.
Great. So now we're going to move on to a new section on legal and ethical issues associated with AI. This covers a myriad of these issues, including intellectual property, privacy, attorney, professional responsibility, and broader ethical concerns. So I'm going to hand it to Vinhcent.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to first off say I'm not the intellectual property expert. I've run into a lot of intellectual property claims in my work. For the most part, everything's a trade secret, right? We've tried to get information on a lot of AI systems, but developers and companies are going to want to protect their source code, right? The training data and the design of their systems overall, right? And those are all trade secrets for the most part. And you can't patent an algorithm. You can at least patent the steps that create the algorithm. But for the most part, I've seen most of the AI that implicates my work be classified as trade secrets, and there are requirements to do that, right? Keep things confidential, making sure employees have only the right employees know about the things that you want to keep secret. But what I also want to think about is other considerations, right? When you're with claiming trade secret protection or patenting or copyrighting these algorithms, right? For one example was in Houston, the Houston Unified School District used an AI system to determine teacher bonuses and also sanction teachers for, if their students didn't hit certain test scores, right? The third-party vendor was the one who actually owned the source code of that teacher management system. And they only gave limited access, right? So as a result, teachers were able to successfully sue the school district, saying they were deprived of due process because they had no way of understanding the basis of the AI's decision. So this was a 2014 case in Texas. And I think the lesson here is, right, is like you can't have IP protections, and courts will impose protective orders. In other instances, they won't, right? When there's different risks involved, right? In Texas, the school was forced to stop using it because they wouldn't explain, or they couldn't explain what the teachers did. But there's a lot of breathalyzer cases, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, where because of the risks, the criminal risks involved, people go to jail, go to prison, get DUIs. Companies were forced to turn over their source code, and we found, the examiners found, thousands of errors in these AI systems that were getting people convicted, right? So I think the lesson is, IP issues can create due process issues and negatively impact a company's ability to use AI. But there are, I think the precedents out there that you can protect a lot of that source code depending on the context. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so Want to talk a little bit about biometrics, personally identifiable information. So what does that mean? It means the information that makes us uniquely us. So you can think of facial recognition technology or using fingerprints. There's a lot of use of fingerprints for timekeeping purposes, or retinal or iris scans. And these technologies, they're getting very creative, reading veins. I heard of a technology that somehow reads brain waves. So this is it's for security purposes. It's to make sure that the person is who they say they are. But the thing about your biometric data is that you can't change it the way that you can change a passcode. So surprisingly, before Illinois passed its Biometric Information Protection Act, there wasn't, and there weren't really laws out there. And since Illinois, we've got Arizona, Texas, Washington, 27 states currently have a similar legislation pending. But what these types of legislations say, and I think it's the rise of seeing so many cyber security attacks and hackers being able to get what is your individually identifying information. It used to be social security cards, but now it's all about this biometric information. And so what has happened in the case of Illinois said, listen, if you're going to be collecting somebody's biometric information, you need to get their consent to do it. And you need to make sure that you're taking the proper steps to really protect and secure that information, and then having ways to safely delete the information. And so what we saw was that in 2019, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled on a case that was against Six Flags. And in that case, a minor had gone on his own to Six Flags to get himself a season pass. And the way to get the season pass was he had to give his fingerprint information. That information was stored so that every time he returned, they would know it was him into the park. Anyway, so the mom was upset. This was done without her consent, without her son's consent. And the Illinois Supreme Court, when they looked at this, the argument by Six Flags is, listen, nothing happened to his biometric information. There's no injury. And the court said, we're not going to wait for an injury to occur. That's the point of this act. And the Supreme Court in 2020 agreed. And so what we've seen since then is this flood of class actions. I think there's over 800 biometric class actions against Illinois employers to date. Last year, Facebook paid $650 million to settle one of the cases. And it's become this situation, and the penalties, $1,000, $5,000. And so what you're really seeing is now this reaction, and there's pending legislation this year to kind of try and dial that back, to have a cure provision. But I think it's very much an indicator of the public really saying, this is my data and I own this data, and if I lose it, it's uniquely mine. So while that's going to, in the vast majority of the cases, the class actions in Illinois, they are settling, you can understand. But I think the legislature's now going to try and dial that back a little bit, so that there isn't such an automatic right to the penalties, and really dialing back the private right of action. So we'll see what happens there.
So Natalie, why is it that the state of Illinois is such a leader on AI while California is kind of lagging behind a bit?
Yeah, well, you would think our California legislature is the most progressive in the country, but sometimes sometimes, states are a step ahead, but we do certainly see, and I know Vinhcent's going to talk about that more, we certainly see these same kinds of efforts. And even with the California Consumer Protection Act, which, I think in many ways is the EU's general data protection act on steroids in many ways. So it's not as if California is not taking these types of moves. And as I said, I know Vinhcent's going to be.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, Illinois, they had that biometric protection, right? I don't know necessarily if that biometric protection law was designed to restrict the use of AI, right? It was, I think, to protect workers. And it just so happened to catch Clearview, it got Facebook, it got so many big data aggregators because they were using this information. So we may be a little bit lucky, but maybe, I actually don't know the provenance of that biometric law, but I think that was such a good hook for a lot of lawsuits.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny, it was a sleepy law for, I think it came out in 2009. And I think that's absolutely right, Vinhcent. Then when you saw there, and there's vagueness in the act, it's not clear what does per incident mean? Does that mean every time that somebody used their fingerprint for timekeeping purposes? So it was a lot of the unknowns that I think led to settlements. Last I checked, the average settlement about $150,000, but then you have the Facebook example of $650 million. Long story short, it has, I think, gotten a little out of control, 800 class action lawsuits. And now the legislature is really looking at what can we do to protect Illinois employers who are being, a lot of other states like Washington, Texas, they don't have these private right of action. So if there are abuses, then certainly the state can go after them. I think that it's a right balance to have these notice and cures, because you really want to be able to go after the bad actors who, knowing that they're not getting the consent, they're not being transparent, they're not being careful about the storage, that if they're continuing the behavior, then I think that's where you really want to be able to go after them. But we'll see what happens with that, watching it closely.
So, attorney professional responsibility. As you know, all lawyers have the duty of competence, and this includes a duty of technical competence as well. Under the ABA Model Rule 1.1, it says that lawyers must keep abreast of changes in the law and its practice, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. So this means that lawyers may not necessarily have to understand how to do AI, but lawyers need to understand the relationship between inputs and outputs, because that impacts bias, it impacts privacy rights as well. So as a general rule, a system's reliability depends on the lower risk of legal liability. It means that we need to remember two things, basically. The first is the risk of bias and privacy breach. And the second is that to understand that AI learns and evolves. We've already seen improvement over time. So we should consider advising our clients to build on periodic checks and balances to ensure that their AI systems remain reliable. So the duty of technical competence requires us as lawyers to stay abreast of all of this information. Moving on to back to Vinhcent.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think I'm going to talk a lot about disparate impact right now, and that's covering, three big laws: the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Title 8 of the Fair Housing Act, and then Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act. We have protections against algorithmic bias. They don't say it's addressing algorithmic bias, but these Fair Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, all of these laws do apply to AI. So we have the disparate impact standard as one way to identify discrimination and bias. And I think that is kind of from a regulator perspective and from a legal perspective, I think is where advocates are pushing the hardest to get more transparency and to find out whether or not disparate impact is happening. So essentially what it is, for just a quick refresher, a disparate impact happens when a company using an AI has neutral policies or practices that have an adverse impact on a member of protected class, right? Disparate treatment, very similar, but it's not neutral, it's on purpose, is when a company treats someone differently based on a protected characteristic directly. So for the most part, AI does not use your race, it does not use your gender, these other protected characteristics to make decisions, especially in areas where we have civil rights protections. But I think the risk here is that the enforcement of the disparate impact in the AI sector is lagging, right? There's not that many examinations, there's not that many requirements that folks do that self-testing, something that Greenlining advocates for, greater self-testing to see if you have disparate impacts in your AI decisions, whether it's housing, job applications, lending. And I guess the one thing that you should do is when you're acquiring an AI system is to ask and think about, has this been tested for disparate impact? Are there differences between how we treat people of color? And if there is a difference, right, what is the reasonable business necessity that justifies that discrimination or that disparate impact? So those are all things that you all should be thinking about as you're implementing AI systems, particularly in protected categories, protected sectors. And other things to think about before adopting an AI system at your company, right, is how have you defined fairness or non-discrimination, right? That is a question I think regulators are going to be asking more and more often of companies. What is your process? They're not going to tell you, as much as I hate to say it, they're not going to tell you what fair is in most instances. But as a risk management tool, it's necessary for you all to know how you've defined this, what's an adverse, what's not an adverse action. Optimization criteria. So this is a thing is, what AI is really good at getting to what it's optimizing for. So a price algorithm is really good at finding the most that you're willing to pay for one thing. But the problem is, AI has no discretion. So you could be charging someone a really high rate at a time where that would be considered predatory, right? Forget the exact word, but like for example, surge pricing during natural disasters, right? That it's optimized for profit, but it's also not optimizing for what's equitable in that situation. So think about what you're optimizing for in your algorithm. Does that take into consideration all of your stakeholder interests? Next is training data. So essentially all data, algorithms learn from your data, machine learning learns from the data. And if you have biased data, so say you're a bank and you have a history of discriminating against people of color in home mortgage loans, like that happened in the 1960s. If you use that data to teach your algorithm how to give loans in the future, it's going to relearn how to discriminate against people of color. It's going to relearn redlining. So you need to make sure that in your training data that this has been corrected for to the extent you can, or you have clean data, or you have as much debiased data as you can. You want to have very representative data. For example, one AI system that was detecting cancer, they had basically majority of men in that training data. So that AI system was actually way worse at detecting lung cancer in women, right? So women were worse off under this AI system. So thinking about the data and what you've put into the AI is very key to minimize bias and to minimize any ethical concerns. And then finally, I mentioned, not finally yet, but due process transparency. You need to be able to explain a decision, particularly if it's a significant one, right? Where you're firing someone, hiring someone, giving a promotion, giving a loan, being able to explain in understandable terms why that decision was made. That's going to be a more and more important consideration in the future as our regulators catch up to our new AI decision-making models. And then finally, workers' rights, impacting recruitment. We talked a little bit about the warehousing algorithms. We talked about worker management algorithms. But I work a lot with labor groups, and there is a great concern, right, around companies are managing their workers like they are robots, right? This is why Amazon has 150% turnover rate in their warehouses, in part, right? So, thinking about, this goes into the optimization criteria again, thinking about how do you make sure that your workers are happy, especially in this kind of employment landscape, making sure that you don't have big turnover because your AI system isn't properly treating your employees, or because you don't have proper transparency so your employees don't know why they're being forced to do something. So those are all things to consider before adopting an algorithm, or even if you have already adopted an algorithm.
So looking at the federal government, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, EEOC, has focused its interest on AI and algorithmic fairness. On October 28th this year, the EEOC announced that it was launching an initiative to ensure that artificial intelligence and other emerging tools used in hiring and other employment decisions comply with federal civil rights laws that agency enforces. So I'm going to turn it over to Natalie, who's going to go into the specifics.
Sure. So, here's the press release that came out late last month, and I will say, before I turn us to the federal level, I want to turn us back to Illinois for a moment, because Illinois was also the first state to come out with what is called the Illinois Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act. And what that does, it's way more recent than the Biometric Act, but it says, listen, if you're going to use the tool, then tell people that you're using the tool. So there's all these candidate assessments now in their hiring tools and their tools to really look at measuring performance. And so what the Illinois Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act says is get the consent from the interviewee, and also disclose the types of things that you're measuring, like how are you using the artificial intelligence. And then after you've collected this information, an employee has the right to say, I want it deleted, and you have 30 days. Now that runs against some federal laws that say you're supposed to hang on to certain information for 1 year, but that's sort of a different issue. And so I think what we saw there is this recognition, there's all of these tools out there. We know that they're being used for candidate assessment. We know that they're being used for other HR applications. And what does that mean in terms of what impact is it having? Yes, it can be great. As I mentioned, a lot of these tools say that what they want to do is have a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce, and that is the reason to promote the fairness as opposed to favoritism that unconscious bias will often result in better outcomes for certain populations. So I think this is a similar step in that direction of saying let's think about putting some regulations around it. Let's think about putting some rules around it. We know that it can be these can be great tools for us to use, but we also know that it could become, as the EEO said, a high-tech pathway to discrimination. And so here's some of the things, we can look at some of the things that the EEOC will be doing on the next slide. Okay. So what they're going to do is establish an internal working group that's really going to do a deep dive into some of the work that will be done on this initiative. listening sessions, of course. And this reminds me a little bit, Phyllis and Vinhcent, of what was done back in 2016 with the Big Data Initiative, really starting to look at some of these issues. And we saw, some progress come out of that, but this, I think the problem and the impact on employees and employers alike has very much been recognized. So to gather information about how are they being adopted, designs, what are the impacts, looking at what works well, sort of similar to the Utah sandbox. There's a lot of vetting that goes on, and then there's a lot of monitoring and public feedback. So really seeing what is working well, who is being transparent, who can explain. The explainability is really key. If you're going to use an algorithm that's going to make correlations, do you understand what those correlations are? Do you really know that it is tied to something that is job performance related, or is it a difference between how males use different verbs, for example? And so really then also, if you're a huge company, right, you're going to have your own internal teams that can do the data analytics, that can run the validation studies, that can do the pilot tests to see, is it good, is it not good? I always, I think it's important, and Vinhcent and you've also alluded to this, how important it is to keep human eyes on outputs and not just let these tools go on autopilot. But what the EEOC will also be doing is really identifying what are those technical tools that we can offer up to employers that are really going to help them make sure that the tool isn't perpetuating historical bias.
So moving on the same topic forward, regulatory agencies can play a strong role in enforcing workplace technology standards. Workers themselves can submit complaints about employer non-compliance to these agencies. And the regulatory agencies also have the authority to proactively audit employers' use of data-driven technology. So looking into the future and looking at a variety of agencies, Natalie and Vinhcent are going to be talking about what's on the horizon, what's happening now and what's on the horizon.
Yeah, I can start off, and I actually don't really want to get into every single agency and what they're doing. I actually work very closely with regulators. I'm on the California Privacy Protection Agency, and I'd rather just talk about kind of where the trends and what we're seeing, right, in from regulators. And I can speak specifically to CPPA as well. But my observation is regulators at the beginning were just kind of waiting. They didn't really do anything. And then we kind of had this notice and consent model of AI usage kind of roll out. And I think we're at the beginning of like the next phase of regulations, in my opinion. We had, I think it started with GDPR, and then now the EU has this draft AI regulation that's pretty comprehensive. California passed Proposition 24, the CCPA, established the California Privacy Protection Agency. I'm on the board of that, and my subcommittee is actually in charge of three things related to AI and privacy, and that is conducting audits of businesses in California that are doing certain amount of data processing with certain amount of revenue. We have risk assessments to see if the use and processing of that data is justified in relation to the risk to the rights of consumers in California. And then finally, we have transparency requirements for automated decision systems, right? We're giving California is giving its residents the ability to opt out of automated decision making and profiling, as well as requiring businesses to give meaningful information about the logic behind the decision making processes. So, just to preface this, these regulations are not coming out anytime soon. We're really talking to a lot of experts at the agency, really thinking about how to make an enforcement and risk assessment and audit regime that works for businesses, but also gives Californians assurance that they are their rights are being protected, right? So it is an important issue for regulators. We've seen the FTC come out with a couple posts saying like, hey, our UDAP laws, or I'm sorry, Unfair Deceptive Practices Act work for AI. Our disparate impact regulations apply for AI. So I'm seeing more signaling of intent to regulate this industry than I had seen maybe a year or two ago. Natalie, your thoughts?
Well, I've always had this feeling, and it seems to be true, that it's for regulations to keep up with technology. I don't think they will necessarily, and I don't know that we want them to, because this is a global economy. We want to be the innovators we are. We want to come up with these solutions that work well, but are we all about transparency, explainability, accountability? Yes, we are. And the laws that currently exist, such as the laws that really looking at adverse impact, they are there, and you don't get a pass just because you bought an AI tool that told you that it was going to do one thing and it did another thing. So we're still going to be very responsible for what are those outputs. What I would love to, I think what's really hard for us is that we don't have what the EU has with the GDPR. Instead, we have this patchwork of various laws, half a dozen, or acronyms, and we're sort of trying to work it out. So I'm all for what are the guidelines, what are the rules around development, those best practices, maybe coming up with safe harbors in certain certain instances, and cure. I like this notion that maybe we're going to deal with all these 800 plus biometric class actions by saying, okay, now we're actually going to help by giving some sort of notice for these agencies and employers who may not even understand that what they're using is actually capturing, storing, and for the tools that simply, like the fingerprint, a lot of times all it's doing is converting that biometric information into using an algorithm, and then you have a mathematical output that matches, but it's not keeping and storing. So all for making this part of a greater discussion. A little bit nervous about regulations going a step too far. And
I'll actually talk a little bit about that. You know what, I will say that is always the concern. I talk to a lot of industry folks, and I talk to a lot of regulators too, and there's a great reluctance to be prescriptive on what to do on these things, right? It's all asking questions right now, right? And I've talked to people from the SFED, I've talked to people from different departments at FTC, and when I say there's more action, I mean regulators are becoming a little bit more technically proficient in understanding what these things are, right? How to ask the questions, what kind of fair lending questions should we ask? But I went to them, I was like, hey, can you just put out, like a guidance for what is, fair in this context? And they're like, no, we won't do that. Because they want companies to experiment. They want to see what their definitions of fair are. We want to learn, and they want to be iterative. So, not to say that, regulators aren't doing anything. I think they're getting more technically capable. And at the same time, I still don't see this great push to tell companies exactly how to do every single thing. It's more documentation, but how do we get effective documentation? I'm hearing a lot of talk about AI to regulate AI, which is a pretty interesting concept.
Oh yes, yeah. That's great.
Yeah, my former agency, the DFEH, Fair Employment and Housing Council, which has a regulatory function, I understand held a hearing on April 30th of this year on the whole issue of AI as it relates to several areas: employment, housing, lending, and healthcare. I don't think there are any regulations, but again, as the two of you said, it's these agencies are trying to learn about AI, asking questions, and just kind of trying to keep abreast of it, and perhaps until there's more understanding, it would probably be counterproductive to have legislation that is too restrictive or confining, or that fall behind technology. So, given everything we talked about, what recommendations do the two of you have on leveraging AI?
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about what I've seen in like what's worked in companies that do it well, right? We have multidisciplinary teams, right? So just having people from different backgrounds is really helpful in understanding what I'll talk about blind spots later, right? For example, Bob.ai was a housing algorithm that's used to give out housing vouchers in California throughout. One of the developers was, had issues like growing up with his name. And he thought about, okay, for our AI system giving out these housing vouchers where landlords can choose who they give it to, let's strip out those names, right? So he was thinking about, from his personal experience, how he was discriminated on because of his name. And he brought that into the design of his AI, right? So that's kind of an example of where having people different experiences is really helpful in capturing, where you may be missing some important information, or where you may be creating bias where there doesn't need to be. And the next is thinking about your overall purpose of the AI. And this goes to AI blind spots. I really recommend people go to AI blind spots. Just Google it. It's a really good framework for understanding why errors and bias enter algorithms. But it's taking time as a company, as a firm, as whoever is adopting the AI system as the team, to think about the purpose, right? And then you start by making sure that your whole overall strategy is around non-discrimination and how to minimize that risk of disparate impact. And there's a whole life cycle. I'm not going to go over all the AI blind spots, but this kind of framework talks about where bias can enter. So training data is one of them. Whether or not there's enough privacy is another blind spot. Whether or not you're using discrimination by proxy. So you're using maybe zip code, but you're not using race, but you're using zip code. That can create discrimination by proxy. So having a good model and strategy where you're intentionally thinking about these things all along the way, rather than like at the end of it, it's like, oh, by the way, like is there AI discriminatory? Building this into the process is a much better way to design non-discriminatory AI. And my final thing about that is it's hard to fix your AI once it's found out to be discriminatory, right? Because you find out it's treating women differently than men. If you give women like a bonus, that's disparate treatment. That's also illegal. So if you just had a fair AI from the beginning and you did your best on the planning stage, it saves you a lot of time at the kind of the output when you're done with their AI from having to fix it, because it's actually really tough to fix the algorithm after the fact. Yeah.
Natalie?
Yeah, well, so I am a very big believer, and I know so many others are, that it's not this us or them dynamic, though. And in fact, historically, when you look at more robots, I'll just keep it really basic, coming into warehouses or just being used for manufacturing purposes, for retail. Over the years, even going back to when we saw robots come in to start making cars, historically, there's not this replacement of individuals. Now, I do think with machine learning tools, there's more of a likelihood to be able to replace an individual, but I think it's really about human augmentation, and that we ought to start thinking about it more, because there are the dull, dirty, dangerous jobs that we'd be happy to avoid having workers do these jobs. And now automation and machine learning has made it such that we can, we can automate more. The vision capability, the motion sensory, the increased dexterity is such that you're seeing beautiful examples of what collaborative robots can do working side by side. There's companies that have automated their call center processes or their accounting processes, but have used the opportunity, and I know it matters if you have the resources or not, but to put money into upskilling workers, recognizing that we're going to have a major skills gap. It's already here, but it's just going to really perpetuate more and more. And I think we're certainly starting to see that in a very major way. And so to look at what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what can be automated, I think what can be automated really should be automated, and then focusing on what is it that really does make us human, and what we can expect to see substituted by a machine of any kind. And then I do think that in order to really leverage these tools, we have to be monitoring through the life cycle. So a lot of it, again, goes back to this educational piece, really explaining to workers, what is this? How is it going to help you? How can you learn? You've heard of examples of collaborative robots being introduced into the workforce, and teams of employees told, listen, you decide what's going to be a good new application for this collaborative robot. And then the winners being able to become cobot managers, which for resume purposes, for upskilling, I think we do have a tremendous skills gap. And by replacing more of the routine repetitive, we can take some of that time and resources and fill that skills gap.
How about cybersecurity?
Well, so many of these tools are going to be a great offense in terms of getting companies ahead, getting parts of our society ahead, right? But because we're putting more access points out there, we have greater vulnerabilities. And so we are, and the pandemic has just exacerbated what we're seeing in terms of these cybersecurity attacks. And unfortunately, still, as a country, we just have not done enough to educate your average citizen or your average worker as to what those vulnerabilities are. And so working remotely, not understanding that something's a phishing scheme because maybe you haven't seen it before. We're also seeing such improvements in deep fake technology. So right now, it's mainly the voice deepfake technology that is used impersonating the voice of an executive at a company and saying, "Hey, you got to wire this money to this account right away, or we're not going to be able to meet our promises to customers, et cetera." And so that's been, and it's embarrassing for companies because employees they continue to fall for it to the tune of just millions and millions of dollars. But now we're also seeing the video deepfake technology, the visual, get better and better. And I think that we need to, for that reason, really be protective about the data that we're collecting, educate individuals, really have a good plan in place. And this kind of goes back to the skills gap problem. Is we have a massive shortage right now of cybersecurity professionals at a time when we really, really need those individuals. And so I think I just read today that Microsoft, I believe it is partnering with community colleges, giving about $250 million to really use those community colleges. And I do think community colleges are very much underutilized for these the skill shortages that we have coming, and really for training for the jobs of the future, and cybersecurity is certainly one of them.
Well, this has been a very informative discussion. I thank you both experts for talking about AI, privacy, and the workplace. It sounds to me that whatever the organization is, a business, employer, the government, that they all must understand the strengths and weaknesses of AI and have a coordinated strategy for adopting that. Strong leadership that can leverage the respective strengths of its employees, as well as guard against bias and privacy breaches, seems to be the best chance of achieving excellence with AI. I'm going to now turn the discussion back to Hayward to see whether or not we can answer some questions from the audience.
Sure, thank you, Phyllis. I think we have a time for a couple of questions. The first question that I have is the trend of surveillance tools expected to continue to be used irrespective of the remote work arrangement? So employers will utilize surveillance and monitoring tools even for employees working on site?
Well, I think even pre-pandemic, it's a great question. Even pre-pandemic, we were really seeing the rise of these tools, and not necessarily purely for surveillance sake, certainly for the sake of measuring productivity, but also there are even some biometric sensors, indicators that can help the employers learn what is a point where we're seeing employees reach a state of fatigue where we need to have them really step back. And you can see that in construction, you can see that in a lot of other types of roles. But we already saw it happening. We saw it accelerate through the pandemic. I know, Vinhcent, that you have some thoughts on that as well.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I think it'll continue. Absolutely. I think the concern for me is like, how are you, like I said, how are they optimizing? How are they defining the metrics, the quotas, and how does that impact the employees? And that's going to be, I guess the market is going to have to figure that out, right? If you're driving all your employees, then you need to fix your algorithm. But I see it staying.
This is kind of industry specific. So will AI diagnosis of medical condition replace standards of care in the medical community?
Yeah, so no, I don't think they are replacing standards of care. I think of all of the AI sectors, I feel like I just feel the most comfortable with the amount of review happening in the healthcare sector. And that's not to say there's a lot of issues with the healthcare sector and AI systems there. But I think there's still a lot of research that's always going on hand in hand, and kind of like the health risks. So I've seen medical standards of care change because of AI. Like they're like, oh, this standard, like this care pattern, I guess, like putting people into certain programs at certain times is now the best practices. So I mean, it's changing in that sense, but I don't think it's changing. I think it's changing in with that human machine teaming, that's happening together, right? Because I do feel like there is a lot of oversight, at least in the healthcare sector that I've seen.
I think I have one more question for you. Some AI has devolved into hate speech very quickly. Famously happened with Microsoft. What are the most current efforts to train AI to be better at preventing itself from being tricked into hate speech?
Yeah, no, that keeps happening, right? Like there was an AI system that tried to learn ethics from Reddit. That predictably did not go well. If you're using, it's really your data sources, right? Where are you picking your data from, right? Are you learning from places where there's a lot of hate speech? Because AI essentially just learns from its data. I think there was a question around like machine learning. Machine learning is algorithms. Like they're called machine learning algorithms. And then instead of humans writing the rules, it's machines learning the rules. So machines are looking at what people type out. They're learning from that hate speech, and then they're recreating it. So To eliminate that kind of stuff, you really have to be careful about the data you select. You have to be able to label that data. That's a huge amount of human resource. Is like they're looking at conversations, they're labeling this as like a positive message or a negative message. And then the computers learn from those labels that certain types of things are good or bad and shouldn't say them. So there are efforts happening, but to be fully automated, it's not really, I don't think that's possible. I think you're gonna always have to be really careful, like a parent, teaching your kid, like, hey, don't learn from those bullies over there. I think that's kind of the equivalent for AI.
Anybody else? Okay, so I think that concludes our program. Thank you, speakers, for your time and commitment in creating and presenting this very intellectual and engaging program. It's been brought to our attention that the link sent as a reminder with the handout was the incorrect link, but that will be corrected with the same email that's being sent out after the program with your MCLE certificate, so you can download the handouts then. So until next time, that concludes our program. And so please enjoy this short video until I see you next.
ADR Services, Inc. has been your unwavering partner in alternative dispute resolution. But as the world changed, so did we. From virtual and hybrid hearings to our ongoing on-demand CLE program, ADR Services, Inc. continues to keep resolution and legal education at the forefront. Woman-owned and operated from the start. There is someone for every situation. We are ADR Services, Inc.